This is lesson 5.2, solving inequalities by multiplication and division. Your objectives are to solve linear inequalities by using multiplication and to solve linear inequalities by using division. With an inequality, you can multiply both sides by the same thing, and you can divide both sides by the same thing. There's one important rule to remember though. If you multiply both sides or divide both sides by a negative, you have to flip that sign around. Greater than becomes less than, or less than becomes greater than. Multiplying or dividing by a positive doesn't change anything. But when you multiply or divide by a negative, you have to remember to flip that sign around. Solve each inequality. Number 1. Y divided by 6 is less than or equal to 2. Well, the y is divided by 6, so do the opposite and multiply both sides by 6. The 6's cancel on the left, and 2 times 6 is 12. So we have all y such that y is less than or equal to 12. Since the 6 was being divided, we do the opposite and multiply it. Number 2, negative n divided by 50 is greater than 22. Since the n is divided by 50, we'll do the opposite and multiply both sides by the 50. And since it's a negative, technically you could rewrite that n over negative 50. We'll go ahead and kill two birds with one stone and multiply both sides by the negative 50. Something divided by negative 50 times negative 50 cancels out the negative 50, leaving n. Since I multiplied both sides by a negative, I got to flip that sign around, so greater than becomes less than. And 22 times negative 50 is negative 1100. So we have all n such that n is less than negative 1100. Since we multiplied both sides by a negative, we had to flip that sign around. Number 3. 3/5 h is greater than or equal to negative 3. Well, that's a 3/5 times h, so let's do the opposite and divide both sides by 3/5. And when you divide by a fraction, you're really multiplying both sides by the reciprocal. So we'll multiply both sides by 5/3. On the left, we get h because 5/3 times 3/5 is 1, and 1h is just h. On the right, if you need to put negative 3 over 1 to help you multiply, that's fine. And you can reduce there. The 3's are both divisible by 3. 3 becomes a 1. Negative 3 becomes negative 1. So you have 5 times negative 1, which is negative 5. Over 1 times 1, which is 1. It's just negative 5 over 1, which is negative 5. All h such that h is greater than or equal to negative 5. Remember, when you have a fraction times the variable, to move it to the other side, multiply both sides by the reciprocal. Number 6. Negative 2/3 b is less than 1/3. Well, I have b times negative 2/3, so we'll do the opposite and divide by negative 2/3. And when you divide by a fraction, multiply by the reciprocal. So really, I'm going to multiply both sides by negative 3/2. Remember, when it's a fraction times the variable, multiply both sides by the reciprocal. On the left, negative 3/2 times negative 2/3 is 1. So you just get b. We had to flip that sign around because we multiplied both sides by a negative. Less than became greater than. And on the right, with our fractions, we can reduce there. The 3's are both divisible by 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. 3 divided by 3 is 1. So we have 1 times 1 on top, 1 times 2 on the bottom, and a positive times a negative is a negative. This is negative 1/2. All b such that b is greater than negative 1/2. Since we multiplied both sides by a negative, we had to flip that sign around. And remember, a fraction times the variable. To move it, multiply both sides by the reciprocal. Number 9, g divided by 5 is greater than or equal to negative 2. Well, that's g divided by 5. Do the opposite of dividing and multiply both sides by 5. Since we're dividing by 5 and multiplying by 5, the 5's cancel, which leaves a g greater than or equal to negative 2 times 5 is negative 10. So we have all g such that g is greater than or equal to negative 10. Define a variable, write an inequality, and solve each problem. Number 14. The opposite of 1/3 a number is greater than 9. Well, the variable will be a number. Pick any variable you like. We'll use n. The opposite of 1/3 a number. Well, the opposite of 1/3 is negative 1/3. That much of a number, that'll be times the number, and that number is n, is greater than, there's greater than, 9. The opposite of 1/3 a number is greater than 9. That's negative 1/3 times n. Do the opposite and multiply both sides by the reciprocal. The reciprocal of negative 1/3 is negative 3. Remember, when you divide by a fraction, you're really multiplying by the reciprocal. Negative 3 times negative 1/3 is 1. 1n is n. Since I multiplied both sides by a negative, we need to flip that sign around. And negative 3 times 9 is negative 27. All n such that n is less than negative 27. When you multiply by a negative, flip that sign around. And when you divide by a fraction, multiply both sides by the reciprocal. When you divide with inequalities, dividing by a positive is just like normal. Divide both sides by the same thing. But when you divide both sides by a negative, you have to flip that sign around. Less than becomes greater than, and greater than becomes less than. So just remember that. If you ever divide both sides of an inequality by a negative, you have to flip the sign around. Solve each inequality. Number 1. 25 times g is greater than or equal to negative 100. The g is being multiplied by 25, so do the opposite and divide both sides by 25. 25 cancels on the left, leaving g, and negative 100 divided by 25 is negative 4. All g such that g is greater than or equal to negative 4. Number 2. Negative 2x is greater than or equal to 9. That's x times negative 2, so do the opposite and divide both sides by negative 2. The negative 2's cancel on the left, and since we divided by a negative, greater than or equal to flips around to become less than or equal to. 9 divided by negative 2, that won't reduce. That's just a negative 9/2. So all x such that x is less than or equal to negative 9/2. Make sure you put the negative out in front of the fraction. Don't leave it in the denominator. That's bad grammar. And remember, since we divided both sides by a negative, we had to flip that sign around. Number 4. Negative 8n is less than negative 64. That's a negative 8 times m. Do the opposite and divide both sides by negative 8. The negative 8's cancel on the left, leaving m. Since I divided by a negative, I got to flip that sign around. Less than becomes greater than. And negative 64 divided by negative 8 is 8. All m such that m is greater than 8. Since I divided both sides by a negative, I had to flip that sign around. Number 7. 30 is less than negative 3n. Well, that's a negative 3 times n. Do the opposite of multiplying and divide both sides by negative 3. 30 divided by negative 3 is negative 10. Since I divided by a negative, I got to flip that sign around. Less than becomes greater than. And the negative 3's cancel on the right, leaving n. Now I have to have my variable on the left. Right now, the mouth is open to the negative 10, so when you put the variable on the left, the mouth should still be open to the negative 10. All in such that n is less than negative 10. Remember, when you divide both sides by a negative, flip that sign around. And since the variable had to go on the left, when I turned the whole inequality around, I had to flip that sign one more time. This one actually got flipped twice, as you can see. Number 13. Negative 40 is greater than negative 10h. The h is being multiplied by 10, so do the opposite and divide both sides by 10. Negative 40 divided by 10 is negative 4. And the h's cancel on the right. Remember, the variable needs to go on the left, so I'm going to have to flip this whole inequality around. The mouth is open to negative 4. The mouth should still be open to negative 4. All h such that h is less than negative 4. Define a variable, write an inequality, and solve. Number 17. 4 times a number is no more than 108. Well, the variable will be a number. Pick any variable you like. We're going to use n. 4 times a number. 4 times a number, that's my n, is no more than, well, if it's no more than, it can't be the greater numbers, so I'll have to be the lesser numbers and the equal numbers. 108. No more than is less than or equal to. Now solve. That's an n times 4. Do the opposite and divide both sides by 4. You get n is less than or equal to 27. All in such that n is less than or equal to 27. Remember that no more than, you can't go higher. So if you can't go higher, then it's the lesser numbers and it's the number that it's equal to. So when you multiply or divide an inequality by a number, if that number is negative, you have to remember to flip that sign around. Less than becomes greater than and greater than becomes less than. Also be careful with your fractions. If you need to divide by a fraction, remember you're really multiplying by the reciprocal. Reduce your fractions, watch your minus signs, make sure everything is in simplest form.